Hello and welcome to the recap for Practical 7 for scripting for interactive media. So this week we took a look at our lighting, and in particular we had to look at the different types of lights that we can use in our scene. So we looked at our point lights, spotlights, we had to look at the skylight and the directional light. So the four main types of lighting. After that we had to look at how we could change the sky. So at the moment we've got quite a bright sunny day, but we can change that by adjusting the color of the clouds and the color of the sky itself. So if we're looking for different weather effects in different times of day, we can adjust that with the sky sphere in conjunction with this directional light that comes in. We also had a look at creating some interactive lighting. So our examples were a trigger box that would enable a light to turn on when the player passed through it. We also then set up a light switch, so the player had to actively find a switch to be able to turn the lights on or off. And finally we had to look at adding a torch to our player character to allow them to toggle that on and off to allow them to explore the environment however they saw fit. So I think the first thing we'll do is we'll have a look at the lighting that comes with Unreal, the first level that you build in Unreal. So whenever you start up a new level, you should always have at least the light source and the skylight. So these come in by default whenever you start a brand new level. So the main one we're looking at here is the light source. And the light source is basically the sunlight. You see it's casting shadows throughout the environment. If I change its position, if I move it left and right, it doesn't particularly do very much in terms of changing the shadows. The main option here is the ability to rotate this lighting source. So you see there is a white line that comes out of the directional light. This is the direction of the sunlight. So if I was to rotate this, you can see that the shadows then change corresponding to where that arrow is pointing. So I can change the time of day by rotating this directional light to cast more shadows, or longer shadows, or shorter shadows. So I can rotate this around, I can move it about, and I can then adjust the shadows accordingly. Okay, so that's our directional light. It comes in whenever we start, and it sort of replicates our sunlight. So now that we've done that, let's have a quick look at the sky here. Let's click on the sky and we'll have a look at some of the options in the default and override settings. So these are particularly useful if you want to change the look of this sky. At the moment it's very bright, it's quite a nice sunny day, but if you're going for more of an overcast look, you can use some of these settings to adjust these. So the first thing we'll probably have a look at is the cloud speed. So this is just the panning speed of the clouds. At the moment it's set to 2, which is quite slow. You can sort of see some movement up there. But if you start to increase this, you suddenly start to see a lot more movement. So if you're going for maybe more of a stormy environment, then perhaps you could set that a little bit higher to give a bit more movement to the clouds. It's going to undo that just now. Cloud opacity is probably quite useful to look at, especially if you're looking for sort of darker, stormier clouds. As you start to increase this, you see the clouds become more and more visible in that sky sphere. If you go too far, then suddenly it starts to have some kind of strange effects, so you probably don't want to go too far with that. See, it starts adding some strange bloom effects over our environment there. Let's maybe just tone that down a little. We'll come back to the star brightness. So that's particularly useful if you're having your game set at night. We can certainly adjust the star brightness to maybe increase that and give a sense of nighttime. Okay, so if I want to change the color of any of these, so the clouds and the sky, I will need to turn off this option here that says colors determined by sun position. So if I uncheck that, these override settings will start to come into play. So if I uncheck this option here, you should see there's a little bit of change there in terms of our sky and our lighting. The main options here are going to be our zenith color, and that really corresponds to the actual color of the sky. So this sort of dark blue indicated by this color here. So if I want to change this, I can click on the color box, and from here I can then say perhaps darken the sky. We could go for more of a darker, sort of less saturated looking sky, and that might give us more of a overcast, kind of stormy looking weather. Maybe we go for more of a grey. Yeah, there we go. And if we click OK, the next option would be cloud color. Particularly at the moment our clouds are very white, so as a sort of stormy day we'd probably have darker grey clouds. So if I click the color for the cloud color there, we can then start to tone down some of those cloud colors there. We can make them a bit darker. Maybe that's a bit too much. Or something like that perhaps. You can also tint the clouds as well, so if you wanted something extreme, you can definitely do that if you want to. Maybe go for a sort of bluish kind of color. There we go. Yep, so we're getting more of an overcast sort of look there. And finally, the horizon color is the area underneath our environment. So our sky sphere stops around about here, and then we have the horizon color. So we can then change that too. So I could perhaps bring some of this down, create this a little bit darker, more into the grey areas there. So already I've now changed this to more of an overcast look. When I play my game, we don't have that very sunny sort of sky we had when we first started. So I can definitely change the time of, or change the weather certainly using these override settings. So worth playing around with and just getting a sense of the type of sort of weather that, and overcast looks that you can get. Okay, I'm going to reset these. So I'm going to click the option for color determined by some position, and I'll reset these options here just so they're sort of back to normal. So one thing that we can also do is we can change the time of day. And at the moment it is probably around about, looking about noon, and that's because the sun is pointing directly down the way. So the directional light, the light source, actually determines the time of day. So as I start to rotate this, the more I rotate up the way, the later the day becomes. So we have longer shadows as the sun starts to set. If I rotate this all the way around, so that line is pointing directly up the way, you can see that line's pointing up the way there. You'll see that the light is now casting underneath our environment and it's hitting the bottom here. So if I want to actually make this into fully night experience, or to actually be able to experience the night properly, I have to enable the refresh materials on my sky sphere. So if I click on this, on the sky sphere, I've just clicked anywhere on the sky, there's an option here for refresh material. And you'll have to click that as soon as you make any changes to the way that directional light's pointing. So if I click refresh material, you see now that we've changed this to an evening scene. Now you start to see that suddenly it looks like it's starting to overexpose, and it's gone very bright all of a sudden, even though I've set it to nighttime. So this is an option that you may want to turn off. I find it particularly frustrating whenever you're trying to set up a nighttime scene. And it's coming from the auto exposure settings that comes built into Unreal. So you can turn this off very easily. You can go up to settings, we go to project settings, and if we scroll down, and we're looking for an option in the engine tab for rendering. If I click rendering, and then we'll scroll down in here, we'll keep going until we get to the default settings, and there's an option here for auto exposure. If I uncheck that option, you see that if I move this aside, you can see that that's then darkened back up. If I turn it back on, you see that it's automatically starting to auto-expose our scene, which isn't something we particularly want in this case. So let's turn that option off to turn off that auto-exposure. And then we can just close the project settings. Okay, so now that we've changed our auto-exposure off, we can have a look at some of the other options that we missed on the sky sphere, particularly the star brightness. So this is going to be particularly noticeable at nighttime when we set this up. So you can sort of see there's a few stars there, but if we want to, we can increase that. We can start to increase the amount of stars, or the brightness of those stars in the sky. So if you really want to exaggerate the fact that this is a nighttime scene, you can boost the brightness of the stars there. Okay, so once we've created our nighttime scene, something we'll need to do, and you might have to do this occasionally, we'll have to do something called build lighting. And basically what this does is allows us to sort of finalize some of our lighting, and it'll give us a more realistic representation of what our lighting should look like. So we can do that by coming up to this build tab. In the drop down there's an option for build lighting only. In the lighting quality, at the moment it's set to preview. This is fine for just now whenever we're working and we're still building our environments. But what you'll need to do before you finish your game is you'll need to build your lighting properly. And I'd recommend perhaps using high or medium. Production will probably take a particularly long time, so it's probably not necessary for this project, but medium or high would be absolutely fine. The higher you set this, the longer it takes to actually build your lighting, so just keep that in mind. I'm going to set mine to preview just now. I'm going to click the drop down, and you see there's an option here that says lighting needs to be rebuilt, 5 unbuilt objects. What this does is it'll actually then apply all of the lighting into the textures of our scene. And we'll come back to this in a bit more detail in a second. I just want to build my lighting properly just now. So we'll do the drop down and do build lighting only. So you see this starts up. It can take a little while depending on how long or how big your scene is, as well as how many lights you've got in the scene, and as well as the type of lighting too. So there are lots of factors that will impact on this. But you see that's mine finished now, and it's now building the lighting. Okay, so now that I've built my lighting, you can see that the scene has gone pitch black. So there's very little light in the scene, and that's because the light is being cast from the bottom to hit the underneath side of our scene, which means there's very little lighting in the scene at the moment. So perhaps if you wanted to leave it like this, you could, and you could start adding individual lights. At the moment, I think this is probably a little bit too dark for the player to actually see where they're going. So rather than leaving it like this, I'm going to add a little bit of ambient lighting just so the player can see without having to have lots of individual lights in the scene. And you can do that with this skylight option. The skylight should come in the scene whenever you start up a new level in Unreal. If it doesn't, you can bring it in from the Lights tab over here. So if you're on your Basic tab, switch over to Lights, and you can bring in the skylight and just drop it into the scene. You should only need one of these. So with that selected, there's an option here called Intensity, and I can increase that. And you see that as I drag this up, it adds a bit more light back into the scene. Now I don't want to go too far with this, just enough that when I play this, the player can still see a little bit of what's going on. So I don't want it to be pitch black. That should be enough. You can adjust this at any time. You just click and drag the intensity to drop that down. There we go. That should probably be enough. So I don't want it to be completely pitch black, so I'll use the skylight just to add a little bit of offset to that. Okay, so now that we've got our scene set up, we can now start bringing in some of the different types of lights that we might want to use within our environment. So I've switched over to my Lights tab. This is where you bring in all of the lights that you'll need. We've already looked at the directional light. This is our directional light. It's the one that's actually turning it from day to night, and it's the one that replicates either the sun or the moon. In this case, we're going to now bring in some different types of lighting, such as the point light. A point light is probably one of the most basic types of lighting you can use. All it is an omnidirectional light that will cast light in every direction. So if I click and drag to bring my point light in, you see that as you clicking and dragging to bring these in, it's dynamically casting shadows as I'm moving this around until I let go of the mouse to add this object. So I'm going to click and drag and just drop it into the scene here. So you see that I can move the light around and it casts light in different ways depending on where I have it in the scene. Because it's completely omnidirectional, you'll notice if I rotate this object, it has no impact on the lighting because it's casting light in every direction equally. So now that I've added my point light, let's have a look at some of the options that we can change. So with the light selected, in the Light tab, there's a few things that we can adjust, such as intensity. So the intensity, as I drag that up, you see the brightness of that light bulb increases. So if I want this to be a bit more subtle lighting, I can definitely decrease the intensity. It's currently set to this intensity unit of candelas, but you can change those by clicking these drop downs here. So you can change it to unitless, which is just an arbitrary value that Unreal uses, or you can change it to lumens, which is probably more for sort of light bulbs. I'm going to leave it set to this, and the default is 8. So whenever you bring in new point light, the default is going to be set to 8. So it's a good idea just to remember that value, so you can adjust it from there. Another option that we might want to look at is the light color. So the light color is set to white at the moment, which is fine for if we're looking at maybe light bulbs in particular. If you're looking for warmer lights though, then you can certainly change this, or particularly if you want colder light too. If you click on the light color, we can then adjust this in the same way that we adjusted the sky. And you see that I can give that really, really extreme color changes. So I'm going to look for maybe something more of a warmer sort of orange light. I don't want to go too far with this though. That's looking quite nice. Let's just leave it like that, and we'll click OK. The last option with the point light that you're likely to change is this one called the attenuation radius. And it's really how the fall off of the light, so how much of the scene is affected by this light. So if I bring this down, you'll see that it affects a smaller area. You see the light's only casting on the inside of this attenuation sphere. If I increase that further, then you see that it starts to cast light on these trees over here, and we're getting some light spill onto this object over here. So those are our options with our point light, and we can start varying these. We can have as many point lights as we need in the scene. So you can start dragging them in. I'm going to delete that just now, and we'll bring in the spotlight this time. So the spotlight's a little bit different, but a lot of the functionality is very similar. So I'm going to click and drag spotlight into the scene. Instead of being omnidirectional though, this is now just one directional light. So it works very much like an actual spotlight does. So if I rotate this now, you'll see that if I do change the position, I can then cast light in different ways. Depending on where I have it in the scene, it casts light wherever I've moved it. It's got that white arrow indicating which direction that light's facing. If I was to rotate this, you'll see that I can then point the light specifically at different objects, and I can rotate that light around. So I can see if I wanted to create a specific type of very directional light, I can use this spotlight to make that a bit more directional. Same options again for intensity. If I wanted to increase the intensity, I can change the light color. So if I went for more of a blue sort of light. And then the other option that wasn't available in the point light is the inner and outer cone angle. And this is really the radius of what gets affected, or what gets where the light actually casts. So if I increase the outer cone, you see that the spread of the light increases. If I decrease that, we get a very, very directional light that's pointing on just one tiny area. So it's sort of changing the focus of that light. We've also got the inner cone here, and the inner cone's a little bit like the fall off we were looking at for our audio last week, where anything inside of that inner cone is the light at its full intensity, and then as you go from the inner to the outer cone, we have a fall off of our light. What you'll find is if you set the inner and outer to be exactly the same, is you get very sharp looking lighting. So you see the edges where the light hits and where there is no light, we get a very sharp line around that light. This might be particularly useful if you're setting up quite a stylized game, such as if you're perhaps using those low poly packs. This type of lighting might be more useful, as it might fit with that visual style a bit closer. If you're going for more of a realistic look, then perhaps you'll want to separate these out a bit so we get more of a realistic spread on our lighting. Okay, so those are our point lights and spotlights, and you can vary these, you can adjust them, you can add them to any sources that you need within your game. One other final option you may want to use is the ability to change the temperature of the light. And this is if you're looking for more real-world lighting, such as different types of light bulbs, is you can adjust this based on the actual temperature value in Kelvin. So if I click the use temperature, as I drag that down, you see I get warmer lighting. As we go up the way, we get colder lighting. So if you want to change from more of a sort of traditional lighting bulb to more of a fluorescent lighting tube, you can get the different temperatures based on these values here. So that's just if you're setting up lighting as if it's coming from an electric light bulb. So we'll turn off the temperature just now. Okay, one thing to keep in mind is the mobility of these lights, and we'll discuss that just now. So I'm just going to delete my spotlight I've added, and we'll do this with a point light. And we'll bring this into the scene. Now, one thing to keep in mind with the mobility is this is how the lighting actually gets rendered in your scene. So just keeping an eye on what this is set to is quite important. The most basic option is static, and if you have lighting that you don't plan to move and you don't plan to have the ability to turn on or off, you may want to leave it set to static. So this is perfect for ambient lighting that we don't necessarily need to change. The problem with static is that once I click that build option, so remember when we went up to build and I do build lighting only, it actually bakes the lighting into the environment and the textures around it. So what would happen is once I've built my lighting and then I delete this light, the light source will actually still stay. It'll look like the light's still there, and it won't go away until I rebuild my lighting. Which means that once the lighting's built, it can never be changed. So the static is useful if you never need to change your lighting. But if you do want a light that, say, has the ability to turn on and off dynamically within your game, you'll need to set it to stationary. So what this means is that when it gets rendered, it won't move throughout the scene. We won't be able to move its position or rotate it if it was a spotlight. But we can turn its visibility on and off dynamically within the game. So this is perfect for a light that might turn on via a light switch. Or if I set the light to turn on via a trigger box. The final option is movable, and this is fully dynamic, but it takes much longer to render into the game. So what's useful about the movable option is that it's perfect if you want to have the ability to cast fully dynamic shadows. This is perfect for if our future example where we're going to create a torch for our player character, we ideally would like the torch to move with our player character. So setting that to movable for that function is going to be, we're going to have to set it to movable to do that. So with this point light here, I'm just going to leave it right now, and I'm going to leave it set to stationary. So what I want to have happen here is we're going to start setting some interactivity into these lights. And I think our first example is to set up a trigger box that when I pass over, this light should turn on. Now I've got my player start just here. I'm going to move it back a little bit. So when I play my game, I start up here. I'm going to put a trigger box somewhere around about here. So whenever I pass over that trigger box, this light over here should then turn on. And we're going to use our level blueprint for this. So we looked at the level blueprint last week, and it was perfect for adding things like trigger boxes. When our player passes over the trigger box, it sends some signal that we should then do something. And in this case, we want that light to turn on. So let's add a trigger box to our scene. And I can go and add this from the Basics tab. And the second from bottom option is the box trigger. So let's bring that in. I'm just going to add it into the scene. I'll maybe need to scale it up a little bit. So let's scale it, just making it long enough that I don't accidentally miss it when my player character passes over. So I'll place that around about there. So I've got my trigger box in the scene. I want my player to start here. As they walk forward, they hit this trigger box, and this light over here should turn on. So the first thing we'll need to do is bring in our level, or open up our level blueprint. So we can do that by coming up to the Blueprints tab, click the drop down, and we'll do Open Level Blueprint. Whenever you open up your new level, you should have these two nodes that appear. We can click and drag, and we can get rid of them. We don't need them just now. Okay. Now, what's really nice about working in the level blueprint is that it links directly to our actual editor, or our scene editor. So if I was to move this aside, I'm just going to click and drag this tab at the top, and we'll just move it aside a little bit so I can see both at the same time. What I can do is with any object selected in my scene, in this case my trigger box, I can then right click in my graph, or in my event graph over here, and I can make references to these. Now before I do this, what I might want to do is just rename this trigger box. So the trigger box is currently called just called trigger box. It's fine if you've just got one, but if you suddenly have lots of different trigger boxes for different types of lighting, you may find that this suddenly gets a bit confusing. So let's maybe rename this, and we'll call this one trigger box for point light. Okay. So with this selected, let's right click in our event graph for our level. So right click, and you should see that there are options specific just to this trigger box. And what we're going to look for is add event for trigger box for point light. We look in collision, and we're going to do this option here that says add on actor begin overlap. What this is doing is whenever we overlap with that trigger box, we send some sort of message to do something. So I'm going to click that option. So that should come up, and you see that this is an event. So whenever we pass over, an event should start. And what we want to have happen is this light over here should then turn on. So that's going to be our next stage, is we need to tell the graph over here to make use of this light. So we're going to click on the light in the scene, so just make sure that's selected. And we need to then make reference to that inside of our environment here. So or inside of our graph, sorry. So if I right click, we can again get options specific just to this light. Now instead of doing an overlap, we want to do this option here that says create a reference to point light. So let's click that one there. So this is just a reference. So we need to make a system that then triggers some sort of change in intensity or visibility and sets it specifically to this light here. So let's do that. And we're going to use a node called set intensity. This is a particularly useful one for lighting. So I'm going to click and drag out of my overlap. Let's do that, click and drag, and I'm going to look for a node called set intensity. There we go. Now you see nothing shows up, and the reason for that is the context sensitive option is turned on. So if you uncheck this, we should see that more options appear, and we're looking for the option set intensity under the lighting tab here. Don't do the skylight, that's a different thing. Let's just bring in set intensity. And you see that we've got set intensity. And there's a target. Currently the target is set to self. We want to set the target to actually be this point light here. So what we can do is we can click and drag out of the point light reference we made, and we're going to connect that up to the self. It'll need to convert so that it can actually be read. At the moment this is an object reference, we need to turn it to a lighting reference. So let's click and drag and we'll connect those up. You should see that a node gets added automatically in between. This just converts our object into a light that can be understood by this set intensity. Okay, so now what is happening is when we overlap this, this light that we've referenced should change to a new intensity. Now our intensity is currently set to 0, so actually what's going to happen is when we pass over this trigger box, the light is going to turn off. Instead, what we want to have happen is we want the light to turn on. So what I'm going to need to do is I'm going to set the new intensity. Now I think the default intensity for the light is 8, so that's something that we can work from. So I'm going to set this new intensity to be 8 in this little box here, and we'll just click enter, just click off that. So this should now work. If I hit compile and I click save, I'll need to save this level, so I'll just call this one test level. And there we go. Okay, so if I close this, this should now work. The only issue being that the light is already set to intensity of 8. So what's going to happen is when I pass over, it will set the intensity of the light to 8, but because it's already set to that, it won't look like there's been any change. So what we'll need to do is with the light selected, let's just set its default down to 0. We'll just click and drag on this and just turn the light off entirely based on the lighting intensity. So now when I play this, what I should happen is the player character moves along here, hits this trigger box, and the light should set from 0 up to 8 because of our level blueprint. So let's try this out. So I move over, and you see that as soon as I passed over that trigger box, the light then turned on. Okay, and we could do the opposite as well. So if we wanted the function to have the light actually turn off when we pass over, we just swap those options around. So if I went to open level blueprint, if I set the intensity to be 0, and I started the base intensity of the light to be 8, the opposite would happen, and our light would turn off when we pass through that. So if we wanted to set up some sort of horror game based on that, we could have our lighting turn off based on where our player character is. Okay, now to make this a bit more interesting, what we might want to do is have some function where rather than the light suddenly switch on just very quickly, maybe we have the light fade in or flicker on or something like that. Maybe that'll be a bit more interesting. And we can do that with a system called the timeline. And we've already looked at this in the example where we created our interactive door. We used the timeline to make the door open from 0 to 90 degrees over a certain period of time. We can use this exact same system for our light here. So let's go back to our blueprints and we'll open level blueprint. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a timeline in between the trigger box and the set intensity node. So if I hold down Alt to disconnect these, just move this aside, and then we'll drag out of the executable of the trigger box. We're going to look for a node called add timeline. And you see that you can rename this, so we'll call this one light intensity. Light intensity. And we're also then going to connect the update to the set intensity. So now we've got a timeline node in between the trigger box and the set intensity. With the timeline, we can then double click on it to bring up an actual track. So we can actually add some animation to this lighting. Let's double click on this. We'll need to add some sort of track. So as soon as you bring up the timeline, you're not going to have anything in there. So I'm going to add a float track. So that's just our standard value track. And the reason I'm using the float is you see that the intensity is already a float value. If I hover over that, you see it says new intensity, it's a float value already. So that's going to work perfectly for setting our lighting. So let's click the little F here on the timeline node. We'll click add float track, and we'll call this one, we'll just call it light intensity as well. Light intensity. And now we need to change, or we need to add some nodes into this graph so that we can see that change over time. Now I want the light to fade on over time, so I need to set a key at 0 and 0. So we want it to start at 0 seconds and be a value of 0, to be fully off. So let's just right click around about the 0 mark here, and we'll do add key to curve float 0. In the time we'll need to reset this, so see it's not quite at 0, so let's hit 0, tap enter. And then we'll need to add a second node, or a second key that actually then sets this light up to its full intensity. So we know our full intensity is a value of 8 with what we're working with. Now we just need to decide how long do we want that fade to take. So I'm going to say probably half a second. So I'm going to click somewhere around about the half-second mark, and we'll add a key to the curve flow there. Now our time isn't quite right there, so let's type 0.5, and our value, we're going to set that to be 8. So let's tap 8, and we'll tap enter. Okay, so you see that the line then shoots off up here. If you click these two options, zoom to fit horizontal and zoom to fit vertical, we should see then that our graph fits perfectly into our view. If I compile this, and we go back to our event graph, the tabs open across the top here. One thing we should do is, you see the length is set to 5 seconds. So this means that it's going to play for a full 5 seconds after it's even reached its full intensity. So let's just set the length to match what our original time is, or our final keyframe. So in this case it's 0.5, and then we'll tap that. So you see that the full length of the timeline is now the same as our final keyframe there. Let's hit compile, and we'll go back to our event graph. So our light intensity float track has been added here, and all we need to do is connect this up to our set intensity in the new intensity plugin here. So we're now saying whenever we pass over the overlap, we trigger this to play, and we're going to play this animation track that takes half a second to change the light intensity up to 8. So let's compile. I'm going to close my level blueprint, and let's test this out. So when I play, what should happen is we should see some fading light rather than just an immediate on-off effect. And so you get that sort of slow fade on. Now you can increase this or decrease the time it takes for that fade just by going into that animation graph and making use of that. So I could make this a bit more extreme. I could go into my open level blueprint, double click back on my timeline, and we can add some variations here. So I'm going to extend this out just a little bit. We're going to say make this maybe 1 second, and I think what I want to have happen is over the time of 1 second the light should go up to its full intensity, but rather than just slowly fade on, perhaps I want to have a flicker effect. So it goes up to an intensity, then it decreases, and then comes back up. I can do this by adding as many points or as many keys as I need. All you need to do is right click on any of the points in the graph and click add key to curve float. You can see from there I can move these around. I can right click and I can then add some more variation here. So what's going to happen is it's going to, at 0 seconds, it's going to be at 0 visibility. It's going to go up to about 4, then back down, and then finally up to 8. So when I play this now, so if I close my level blueprint, let's click play. See, we get sort of a flickering kind of fade on effect there, which is a bit more interesting than just having a quick sudden switch on off effect. So we can make use of that, and we can vary these. You can have as many trigger boxes and as many lights as you need in the scene. Okay, so that's our basic trigger box functionality. Now what I could do is I could also then have the light turn off based on if my player character actually moves away from this trigger box. So if I have the player move into the trigger box, the light turns on, but then what I would quite like is the light to actually turn off when they then leave that trigger box. So we have some sort of automatic lighting system. So I can do that by going up to blueprints, and we'll again open our level blueprint, and we'll just close the timeline just now. With the trigger box, there are other options available. You see mine is set to begin overlap. If I just move this aside, remember with that selected, we can make references to it. Oops. Just make sure that our graph's big enough here, and we'll move this down. So with that selected, I can right click and I can go to add event for trigger box, and I can go to collision, and rather than begin overlap, let's do end overlap. What I want to have happen is when we overlap, I want the reverse of this animation to play. So if I click and set that up to the reverse, it's actually going to turn the light off. So if I hit compile, and we now close that, and we'll play this. So when I pass into the trigger box, the light turns on. What should happen is when I then leave the trigger box, so the light then turns off. So if you want to have automatic lighting that works without the entirety of, say, a certain room, all you need to do is set the dimensions of the trigger box to be the same as your room. So just fill the whole room with this trigger box. When the player then enters the room, the light should turn on. When they leave it, the light would then turn off. So that would be our functionality for trigger boxes, and that should be enough that you can then start setting up your prototype to have slightly more interesting lighting and a bit more dynamic lighting. Okay, so our next example was something a bit more sort of active. It requires a bit more active interaction, and we're going to set up a system just over here where that we click on a light switch and it turns on a light near it. So let's set that up. So instead of using the level blueprint, we are going to go back and start using our blueprints that we're creating inside of our content browser. So I'm just going to click over here. I could add this into my blueprints folder, but just so we can see what's going on quickly, I'm just going to right click down in my content browser here. We're going to go to blueprint class, and we're going to choose actor. So actors are basically our standard blueprint classes. We've already got a player character, so we don't need any of those. Just actor is fine. Let's click that, and we'll call it BP. We'll call this one, I'll just call it tutorial switch. I'll tap enter. Okay, so nothing inside of this blueprint, so we'll need to open this up. So let's double click, and I'm just going to add something really straightforward, just a basic box, but if you've got a static mesh for, say, a light switch that you want to use, you could then click add component, and you could do static mesh. Instead, I'm just going to add this option here that says cube. It's a bit big, so let's scale it down. So we'll click on this, and then we'll scale it down, and maybe just make it a little bit more sort of light switch looking. So maybe make it a bit shorter, maybe a little taller, and then we'll just move it a little bit further forwards. Okay, so there's my very basic light switch. I could add a bit more content. In fact, I could go to add component. I could add another cube into this, and we can move that around. And what I could do is I could scale this down just to give a representation perhaps of a light switch. If I move this, and we'll just put that in front, we get, I suppose, a sort of suggestion that that might be a light switch. In fact, if I rotate this too, I can then make a switch. A sort of looks a little bit like a switch, I suppose. And then we can move that forwards and backwards. Okay, right, so what I'm going to do is, now that I've got my light switch set up, I can actually now start adding some functionality to this to make sure that it actually, I can actually turn lights on and off in my scene. So what I'll need to do is go over to my event graph. Remember, whenever you start a brand new blueprint, you're going to get these 3 nodes. We don't need any of them right now, so let's just select them all and delete. Okay, so this system uses our same interaction system from the past few weeks. Remember, our player character has a line trace that whenever we click the interact key, a line comes out of them, and then they send a message through this thing called the blueprint interface. So whenever we're setting up these functions, we're going to be using our blueprint interface. So the first thing we have to do to make sure that we're getting the correct nodes is we need to go up to class settings. And then in the interface dropdown, we'll look for BP my interface. So let's click that. Okay, and then we're going to hit compile, and from here, as long as we've got the BP my interface, you might have called yours something different, so just try and keep in mind what you were naming these. I'm going to right click, and I'm going to look for an event called onInteract, and this is the name that I gave it inside of the interface itself. So again, if you've named it something different, just keep in mind what that was. Event onInteract. Okay, so with this, I can now start dragging this out, and we can start setting some intensity on our lights. However, before I do that, I actually need to make reference to the lights that I want to turn on. So if I move this aside just now, I'm actually going to snap this over at the top here, just so I can toggle back and forth between my environment. I'm actually going to bring in the light just now, and I want to effect, and I'm just going to have it sit maybe somewhere around about here next to the wall. I would ideally like to be able to select this light and make sure that I can reference it with my blueprint. So what we're going to need to do is we'll need to go back to our light switch. We're going to have to make something called a variable. And a variable is just a way of us storing some information so we can recall it later. In this case, our variable actually needs to hold the name of the light that we want to affect. In this case, it's called point light 2. I could rename that, but I'm just going to leave it as is just now. So going back to the switch, in the variables tab here, I'm going to click the plus variable. So we'll click plus variable, and I'm going to call it light. Call it light. The type is currently set to Boolean, which is our true or false value. So having our light on, or the light that we want to turn on is not really a true or false value. So we need to change the type here. So with the variable type option, with it selected, we're going to click the drop down where it says Boolean, and we're going to, in the search menu, look for something called light. So there's an actual variable already created to store light information. You see it's under here called object types, and we've got light and object reference. So let's just click light, and you see that this is a little different now. So this is a light variable. So we can actually store information from our game world into this blueprint. Now we're just going to use the same setup that we did last time. We're going to click and drag. We're going to do set intensity. Again, we might need to turn off our context sensitive. And then we've got light, set intensity. And from here, then we'll click and drag our light out of our scene. So I'm clicking and dragging on the variable. I'm going to drop it in, and you remember any variable you have an option to either get or set. In this case we want to get that lighting, so we want to get that variable and we're going to set that to be the target of the set intensity. Okay, so I've dragged in my light variable and I've connected this up. So the next thing that we could do is we'll need to set the intensity. Now I could use the same system from before. I could right click, I could remove this, and we could add a new timeline in, and that would be totally fine. That would work absolutely great. So let's do that. Let's go add timeline. Going to do the same system from before. So add timeline. We'll call this light intensity. Nope. And then double click. Add our float value. Call this light intensity. There we go. And let's add our points. We'll right click, add key to curve float. We'll set it to be 0. And again, remember our second value is 8. And we're going to say, let's make that take a second to turn on. So we'll click there, set the time to be 1, because we want 1 second, value to be 8, and we'll tap enter. Okay. And we'll just set our length to match the final keyframe, so that'll be 1. Okay. And let's compile. That's all we need. So remember, we're going from 0 up to 8 over 1 second. So I can close that. Our light intensity is here. Let's set that up into the new intensity and the update into our set intensity. Okay, so now we've got a system that when we interact, so we do event on interact, play this animation, set intensity of the light component, which is our light. Now, in our test level here, we've got our light set up, and we actually need to bring in our blueprint. So let's just click and drag to bring our blueprint into the scene. I'll just rotate mine so it's correctly sitting. I mean, we need to turn on snapping here. Turn that so it rotates 90 degrees. And I'll just place it into the scene so it's sitting on the wall. Now I need a way of telling Unreal that when I click on this switch, we actually affect this light. Because at the moment all we've done is put this light into the scene, but we haven't said this blueprint or this switch should affect that specific light. So we need to make a way of putting this light into the variable here inside of our switch blueprint. And we can do that by making sure that this variable here is public. If it's not public, what it means is this variable can only be accessed by anything within this graph here. If I click this little icon here, it looks like a little closed eye. What that means is this variable will actually be accessible outside of the blueprint by other objects. So I can actually add the light in my scene into this variable. So if I click that option, it looks like more of an open eye. If I hit compile, let's go back to my game. If I click back on the switch, what you should see is there's a default tab now. If I uncheck that eye, that default tab is going to disappear. And at the moment it says light, because that's what our variable is called. You should see there's a drop down, and from here I can choose the light that I then want to affect. In this case, point light 2. Let's click that. I think it was point light 2. Yes, point light 2. And that's affect point light 2. Okay, and that should be it. So if I hit compile, I then should set the intensity to be 8 with this animation. So I'll need to go back to my test level, and again I'll need to set the base intensity here down to be 0, just so it's turned off to start with. And let's test this out. So if I play, so I'm going to click on the light switch. So you see I'm clicking near the light switch but not on it, nothing's happening. When I click on the switch, the light then turns on. If I click on it again, nothing's going to happen. And the reason is that I haven't said anything to happen when I switch on it again. I've only got a play function. If I go back to my switch blueprint, if I disconnect this, I can use a flip-flop node, which is quite useful. So flip-flop. And what I can do is set the A connection up to play and the B connection up to reverse. So what should happen now is our flip-flop basically is it plays A first and then it plays B. So if it plays A, it's going to play. Once I click on it again, it'll trigger B, which in this case just reverses it. So it just inverses our light. So let's hit compile and try that out again. So when I click on this, my light turns on. Click on it again, the light turns off. So now we've got a light switch that affects just this light, and I can then move this around wherever I'd like in the scene, and they're still linked together. So I can then click on the switch, and you see the light turns on over there. So now you've got a way of potentially allowing the player more active exploration, as they perhaps have to find the light switch in order to see where they're going. So this might be a useful way of, say, certainly revealing information or revealing more about your game world. Okay, so that's our basic light switch. So let's close this down just now. So the final thing that we're going to do with our lighting is make some fully interactive functionality for a torch. So this is going to be very useful for allowing our player to turn the torch on and off. So we're going to set this up so it is a toggle button that we can click on, and it turns that light on and off. So let's set that up. What I'll need to do is, first of all, before we do this, is I'll have to set a new key to turn on the torch. So this is going to be in our key binding settings. So I'll have to go up to Settings, Project Settings, and remember where we saved our key bindings was in Input. So under Engine and Input, I'll need to add a new action mapping. So when I press a certain key, we trigger a flashlight to turn on. So in Action Mappings, I'll click the plus here, and I'm going to call this one Flashlight. And again, we'll need to choose a key binding for this. So let's set that to be, I'm going to set mine to be F for flashlight. Again, you could set it to anything you'd like though. So there's F, there we go. Now remember, with your input settings, you always have to export them if you make any changes. So we'll have to click Export, and we'll have to go to Input, just save over that. So click Save, it'll ask you to replace it, click Yes. Okay, now we can close that. Alright, so we're actually going to put the flashlight into our player character blueprint, because we want the light to be wherever our player character is. So I'm going to click on My Blueprints, my BP, my player character. So this is where we've added our functionality for our interaction. So we've got our line trace, we've got our movement, and our footsteps are all there. I'm just going to go down to the bottom here, and this is where we're going to start adding our flashlight. Now before I do that, I'll actually need to add it in the viewport. So if I go over to my viewport tab at the top, this is where our camera is and our capsule. If I go to Add Component, I'm going to add it as a spotlight. So a spotlight probably makes more sense as a torch, I would imagine. So let's click the drop down there and Add Component. We'll do Spot. There it is, Spotlight there. Let's click Add Spotlight. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to move mine up a little bit so it's almost being like it's cast directly out of our view. Now you can test this out straight away. We can hit compile right now. We can go to, actually let's rename this first. Rename Spotlight to Flashlight. Hit compile. Let's go back to our test level and let's just press play. You should see that as I start to look around, there is a light being cast directly in front of us. But it's not perfect as a torch. It's okay, but I think we could make this maybe look a bit more like a torch. So I'm going to go back to my player character blueprint. I'm going to maybe increase the intensity just a little bit. I'm going to set this to maybe 10,000. Seems quite high, but I think that should be enough. And I'm also going to change the inner cone angle, and I think I've decreased the outer cone, so it's perhaps not casting so brightly, or such a wide sort of arc. Let's test that out. Yeah, so that looks a bit more like a torch now. We get a bit more directed light, pointing directly in front of us as we move around. So I think that looks pretty good. Let's get some functionality to actually be able to toggle that on and off. So I can go to Player Character, go to my Event Graph, and down the bottom here, let's start adding some functionality. Now we need to then make reference to that flashlight key that we set up, so our key binding for flashlight. We'll right click and we'll go Flashlight. Remember our action events are flashlight. So just whatever you called it, we're looking for the actual input action. So you should see pressed and released. When I do this, I am going to drag out and we're going to do Set Intensity Flashlight. And you should see that the target's already set to be the flashlight there. And then we need to set our intensity here. So again, what we could do is we could, in fact, let's get that some sort of fade in, fade out effect again, using our animation. So drag out the pressed, we'll do Add Timeline. And we'll say, we'll call this Flashlight Intensity. Same again, float track, add our points, same as before. So we'll set it at 0 and 0. Now this time we're not using a value of 8, so I think we're using the unitless setup for our light. Flashlight, yes, currently set to unitless. I could change this back to the candle as if I want, but I've already set mine up to 10,000, so I'll go back to here. And this time I'm going to say I want maybe half a second for the light to turn on. Set that to 0.5. This time my value is going to be 10,000. Tap enter. Okay. Let's compile, and we'll go back to our event graph. Okay. Oh, sorry, one thing we should do is just make sure our length is set to be the same as our keyframe, so 0.5. Otherwise we'll have a big delay. Oh, sorry, 0, yeah, 0.5. So otherwise there'll be a delay between turning the light on and off. Go back to our event graph, and we'll set update to set intensity. And we'll set, oh, I haven't named that, so that's called new track 0, but you could call it light intensity, but I could set that up to my new intensity now. And again, we'll still need that flip-flop node, so let's bring that in. Flip-flop, connect A up to play, and B up to reverse. So when I press the key for flashlight, which is F, we toggle the intensity to be 10,000, and then we turn it off. So again, we'll need to go back to our viewport and set the starting intensity of our light down to 0. Otherwise the torch will start on. Let's hit compile, and let's test this out. So when I play, light's off, but if I press F, you see the light then fades on. If I press it again, it turns off. So now I've got a system for toggling a light switch and toggling a torch on and off. Okay, so now what I could do is I could go back in and I could add some adjustments to my graph. I could make this more of a flickering effect. Compile. So you can make changes very quickly with the graph editor. So if I press this, so I get more of a sort of flickering, dying battery sort of look, which might be particularly useful. And all of my functions are still there. I think I've still got this. Yeah, so everything, all of these systems are still working together. I've got my trigger box, that light turns on when I leave it. And this is still with the torch on. I've got my interactive light switch, I can turn that on and off. So these functions all work together, and you can keep using these in conjunction with each other. So that should hopefully give you a sense of how you might start setting up your lighting, make it a bit more interesting. What I'm going to do is I'm going to have a look at I'm going to create a advanced lighting tutorial that's going to look at how you can add multiple lights into the scene to be controlled by the same light switch using something called an array. We'll also have a look at how you can set up light functions as well. So light functions are particularly useful for creating sort of flickering lights and a bit more sort of randomness on the way the light flickers and changes intensity over time. So I'll do those as separate videos. So this should cover the basics just enough that you can then start setting up your prototype. You've now got the function to set up some interesting types of lighting and some more interactivity within that. Okay.